The words came out of Clayton Yates like a confession he had not meant to make aloud, quiet and rough-edged as gravel in a dry creek bed, spoken to the amber light fading over the Kansas plain. "I cannot seem to find a reason to leave." Fannie Garner stood with her back to him, her hands white-knuckled around the handle of the water pail, and she felt those words strike her somewhere behind her ribs where she had been trying very hard not to feel anything at all. 4 months. 4 months this man had been sleeping in her barn, eating at her table, working her land with the kind of quiet, bone-deep commitment she had never once asked of him. 4 months she had told herself he would be gone by morning, that drifters always were, that she knew better than to build anything out of a man whose saddlebags were always packed. She turned around, and the mistake she made was looking at him directly. Clayton Yates was leaning against the fence post he had replaced himself back in July, his hat pushed back on his head, his jaw dark with the shadow of a man who had forgotten to shave, because he had been too busy repairing her south pasture gate since sunup. The harvest was in. The wheat stood bundled and golden in the dry October air, and he was still here. "That is the most dangerous thing you have ever said to me," Fannie told him, and her voice came out steadier than she felt, which was the only mercy the evening offered her. He looked at her in that slow, deliberate way of his, the way that always made her feel as though he was reading something written just beneath her skin. "Maybe," he said, "but it is the truest thing I know right now." She set the pail down hard on the ground, and the water sloshed over the rim and darkened the dry earth. And she said the thing she had been holding back since the first week of June, when she had found him half dead against her barn wall with a bullet wound in his shoulder, and a story he refused to tell. "Clayton Yates, you do not get to do this. You do not get to stay through the whole of my hardest season. Let me lean on you. Let my daughter trust you. Fix every broken thing on this farm, and then stand there and tell me you cannot find a reason to leave. Because the reason you have to leave is the same reason you rode in here half dead in the first place, and you have never once told me what that reason is." The silence that fell between them then was the kind that carried weight. The kind that held secrets inside it like stones inside a river. And the story of how they had arrived at this moment, at this threshold between everything and nothing, had begun in the scorching first week of June, 1883, in Barrows Creek, Kansas, when Fannie Garner had walked out of her house at 4 in the morning because she could not sleep, and found a stranger bleeding in her barn. The summer of 1883 had arrived in Barrows Creek with the kind of heat that made men mean and women desperate. The grasslands of western Kansas stretched out in every direction under a sky so wide it felt like a threat, and Fannie Garner had spent the past 14 months running her late husband's wheat farm alone with nothing but a 7-year-old daughter named Clara, a 3-legged hound named Jasper, and the stubborn, grinding certainty that she would not lose this land the way she had lost everything else. Robert Garner had died in the spring of 1882, not heroically. Not in the way the widow's stories in the Eastern papers romanticized. He had died of a fever that came on fast and left faster, taking him with it in the space of 6 days, while Fannie sat beside him and watched it happen. He had left her with 60 acres of wheat land, a debt to the Barrows Creek Cooperative Banking House, and a neighbor named Elias Pratt who had begun stopping by with casseroles and suggestions about selling. She had not sold. She had planted instead. The wheat that summer of 1883 was the best she had ever brought in if she could hold it through harvest, but she was behind on everything. The fence along the south pasture had collapsed in a May windstorm. The grain storage roof was leaking. The horse she had planned to use for pulling the McCormick reaper had gone lame in April. And Elias Pratt kept appearing at her gate with his hat in his hand, and that particular smile that never quite reached his eyes, offering help that always came with a price she had no intention of paying. She had been awake the night of June the 7th because she had been running figures in her head, trying to calculate whether she could afford to hire 2 men for harvest season or only 1, when Jasper began to growl. Fannie Garner was not the kind of woman who ignored what a 3-legged hound told her about the dark. She had dressed quickly, taken Robert's old shotgun down from the wall, and walked out to the barn with a lantern. She found Jasper nosing at something slumped against the interior wall beside the hay. When she brought the lantern close, she discovered that the something was a man. He was young, probably not more than 27 or 28, lean and broad-shouldered, dark-haired, with a face that would have been handsome if it were not currently the gray-white color of old ash. His left shoulder was soaked through with blood that had dried in a crust and then opened up again, and his breathing was the ragged, shallow kind that spoke of a body working hard just to keep going. Fannie stood over him for a full minute with the shotgun ready, because she was not a foolish woman, and a bleeding man in a woman's barn could mean a dozen different kinds of trouble. But there was also the simple, unignorable fact of him lying there like something the prairie had chewed up and spat out, and the fact that she was the kind of person who could not leave a suffering creature to its fate, whether that creature walked on 4 legs or 2. "You awake?" she asked. His eyes came open. They were dark brown, the kind of brown that had copper in it, and even half delirious with blood loss, they were absolutely alert. "Yes, ma'am," he said, and his voice was low and careful, like a man accustomed to speaking in places where being heard was dangerous. "You have a bullet in that shoulder. Went through, just bleeding some." "Just bleeding some," she repeated flatly. "You are bleeding considerably. What is your name?" A pause, the kind of pause that contained a decision. "Clayton Yates." "Is that your real name?" Another pause. "Today it is." She should have sent him away. Later, she would think about that moment many times and understand that it was the pivot point, the place where the whole trajectory of her life changed without her fully realizing it. Instead, she set the shotgun against the wall, went back to the house for her medicine kit, and spent the next 2 hours cleaning and dressing a wound that was, as it turned out, a great deal more serious than just bleeding some. He did not tell her who had shot him. She did not ask again that night. What she did do, when she had him stable enough and wrapped in clean linen, was tell him he could sleep in the barn until he could walk to his horse without falling down, and not 1 day longer. He said, "That is generous, ma'am. Thank you," she said. "Do not make me regret it." By morning he could walk to the water trough without falling down, though it was a near thing and cost him visible effort. She watched him from the kitchen window, calculating him the way she calculated everything, and what she saw was a man who moved with the discipline of someone who had learned to push past pain as a matter of survival. He had unsaddled his own horse without being asked and turned it into her spare paddock. He had also, she noticed, folded the blanket she had left him into a neat square and placed it on the hay bale with her lantern beside it. She brought him breakfast and told him he looked terrible. "I have been told," he said. "Where are you from?" "Various places." "Where are you going?" He looked at the horizon for a moment. "I am working that out." She sat down on the hay bale across from him, which was not a thing she would normally do, but she was behind on sleep and the strangeness of the night had lowered her usual careful barriers a fraction. "You are a drifter," she said. "I prefer traveler, but yes." "And someone shot you." He met her eyes. "Someone tried. Do they know where you are?" He was quiet for long enough that she understood the answer was "I do not know," which was an honest answer, and she gave him credit for it. "I have a daughter," she said. "She is 7 years old. And I have 60 acres of wheat that needs to come in at the end of August. And I have more work than I have hands for and barely enough money to hire the help I need. If you brought trouble here, Clayton Yates, I need to know that right now." He looked at her with those copper-brown eyes, and she felt the weight of what he was not saying pressed up against the air between them like a hand against a window. "I did not bring it here," he said finally, "and I have no intention of it following me here." It was not everything she wanted to know, but it was enough for that morning. She told him he could stay another 3 days. He stayed the rest of the summer. It happened gradually, the way most significant things do, through the accumulation of small moments that none of them seemed like much on their own. The first thing he did, without being asked, was repair the south pasture fence. She came out on the second morning to find him working at it steadily with a post-hole digger and a length of wire. his bandaged shoulder clearly giving him trouble, but his jaw set with a stubbornness she would come to know well. She stood at the fence line and watched him for a moment. "You are going to tear that wound open," she said. "I am going to fix your fence," he said without stopping. She went and got the other post-hole digger and worked the section he could not reach without twisting his shoulder, and they worked in silence for 3 hours, and the silence was not uncomfortable, which surprised her. She had grown accustomed to silence being a thing that pressed down with weight. This silence had a different quality. It had room in it. Clara discovered him on the 3rd day. Fannie had been dreading this, because Clara had her mother's directness and her father's trusting heart, which was a combination Fannie considered worrying in a world that did not always deserve trust. Clara appeared at the barn door with her hair in 2 uneven braids and regarded Clayton Yates with the frank, evaluating stare of a 7-year-old who has already learned that the world is unpredictable. "Mama says you got shot," Clara said. "Your mother is correct," Clayton said. He was oiling the saddle he had no immediate use for, doing it because it needed doing. "Does it hurt?" "Some." "Do you know how to braid hair? Mama says she is terrible at braids." "I think she is pretty good, but she says she is not." He looked at the 2 lopsided braids and back at the little girl's face. "I have braided a horse's mane before. That is probably different." Clara considered this. "Maybe not that much different," she said. Fannie, listening from the doorway, pressed her hand over her mouth to suppress something she was not ready to name. By the end of the 1st week, it was simply understood that Clayton Yates was staying. This happened without any formal declaration. It happened the way water finds its level, through the natural logic of a situation. He was there. The farm needed work. He was willing and capable, and the work got done. He fixed the grain storage roof. He built a new gate for the south field. He found the source of the water pump's irregular pressure and spent most of a Sunday afternoon making it work properly again. He did not ask for pay, and she did not offer it directly, but she fed him 3 meals a day at her table, and he accepted that with a simple, quiet gratitude that was nothing like the entitled gratitude of a man who expects to be served. The first time they disagreed, it was about the McCormick Reaper. "The horse is still lame," she said, looking over her July plans with the grim pragmatism that had become her primary mode of being. "I cannot pull the Reaper without a working horse. I will have to cut by hand or hire a team." "What kind of lameness?" he asked. "I am not a farrier," she said, which was not an admission she made easily. He looked at her patient horse, Biscuit, a sturdy roan mare who had gone lame in April after stepping badly in a gopher hole. He lifted each hoof and examined it carefully, pressed and prodded along the leg in a methodical way that indicated he knew what he was looking for, and then he stood up and said, "She is healing. She has been healing for weeks. She is just hesitating because she expects pain." "Horses do not expect things," Fannie said, because she disagreed and she did not pretend otherwise. "Ma'am, horses expect things all the time," he said. "What she needs is short, gentle walks every day on soft ground. Build her confidence that the leg will hold. Give her a month and she will pull your Reaper just fine." Fannie looked at him. Then she looked at the horse. Then she said, "If you are wrong, I will have to hire 2 men instead of 1. "I am not wrong," he said with a certainty that was not arrogance, just certainty. He was not wrong. She did not tell him so directly. But she noticed him watching her face. The first morning Biscuit walked a full circle of the paddock without hesitating, and she saw the small, private satisfaction in his expression, and something in her chest shifted with a warmth she immediately told herself to ignore. The summer days fell into a rhythm. She rose before dawn and made biscuits or cornbread, because she believed in a real breakfast and would not be told otherwise. Clara would appear at the table sleepy-eyed and willing to eat everything in sight. Clayton would come in from the morning chores he had begun doing without her asking, hang his hat on the hook by the door, wash his hands at the pump, and sit down across from Clara. He drank his coffee black and ate whatever was put in front of him, and read whatever part of the week-old newspaper she had finished with first. They talked about practical things. about weather and wheat prices and what the cooperative in town was paying per bushel, about whether the South field would come in heavier than the North, about the price of coal oil for winter, about nothing that touched the deep, guarded center of either of them. But the tension was always there, the awareness of him. She noticed it in small ways she resented herself for noticing. The way the kitchen felt different when he was in it. The way her eyes found him across a field without her meaning to look. The way she listened, at night, to the sounds from the barn with a quality of attention she told herself was simple vigilance. In July, Elias Pratt came to call. Fannie had expected this. Pratt was 51 years old, with a prosperous spread of 400 acres to the north, and a reputation in Barrows Creek that was built more on intimidation than goodwill. He had been widowed for 8 years, and had made his interest in Fannie Garner's situation clear in the weeks after Robert's death, though he had disguised it, as men like him often did, in the language of neighborly concern. He arrived in his good buckboard with his hat in his hand and his smile in place, and he found Fannie in the vegetable garden with her sleeves rolled up, and he also found Clayton Yates on the porch, sharpening a scythe blade with the methodical focus of a man who is very good at ignoring people he has already assessed. Pratt's smile went carefully neutral. "I did not know you had taken on help, Fannie." "Fannie," she said, standing up and pulling off her gardening gloves. "Mrs. Garner, Elias." She had told him that before. He had a habit of ignoring it. "Mrs. Garner," he said, adjusting to the correction without changing his approach. "I was coming to inquire about the harvest. It occurred to me that if you were in need of assistance this season, my men will be finished with my own fields by mid-August. I could loan you 3 workers." "That is kind," she said. "I have the help I need." Pratt looked toward the porch with the measured, assessing look of a man taking inventory. "One man, Fannie, Mrs. Garner. A harvest like yours needs at least 3 to come in properly. I have arranged for additional help from the Weber boys for harvest week," she said, which was something she had in fact arranged just the previous day. "And my equipment is in good order this season." Something moved behind Pratt's eyes that she did not like, not quite anger. Something more calculated. "Well then," he said, "I will just say the offer stands if circumstances change, and I have also come to discuss the matter of the land note with the banking house. I understand your payment is due in September." The sentence dropped like a stone into still water. She had been very careful not to let her financial situation become common knowledge. The fact that Elias Pratt knew about her September note meant he had been looking into it, which meant he had connections inside the Barrows Creek Cooperative Banking House that he was not shy about using. "My payment arrangements are between myself and the bank," she said, and her voice was perfectly level. "Of course," he said. "Only, Hadley at the bank mentioned the land has been assessed recently, and if there is any difficulty meeting the note, I would be willing to take it on myself. As a neighborly courtesy, naturally." "Naturally," she said. "Thank you for riding out, Elias. I will see you on Sunday at church." She turned back to her garden and did not watch him leave. But she heard the buckboard rolling away, and she heard, a few minutes later, Clayton's voice from the porch. "He has been watching you for a while," he said. "Not just today." She did not ask him how he knew. Men who had lived the way Clayton Yates clearly had knew how to read a threat. "He wants the land," she said. "It's for a year." "Does he want more than the land?" She pulled a weed with more force than was strictly necessary. "That is not your concern." "No," he said, "but I thought I would ask." She looked up at him then, and the afternoon light was coming at a low angle across the porch, and she could see the sharpness in his face, the watchfulness, and also something else. Something that looked, briefly, like protectiveness. She looked away before she let herself think too much about it. "He is not a danger," she said. "He is a nuisance with resources." "Those are sometimes the most dangerous kind," Clayton said, and went back to the scythe. He was right, of course. She suspected this, but was not willing to grant it aloud just yet. The evening that changed the interior weather of everything between them happened on a Thursday in late July. Clara had been put to bed early with a slight fever, nothing serious, but enough to make Fanny's heart do the thing it always did when Clara was unwell, that particular clenching that was pure maternal terror dressed in practical clothing. She had sat with Clara until the child fell asleep, and then she had gone out to the porch because the house felt too small for how worried she still was, even knowing the fever was mild. Clayton was on the porch steps. He had taken to sitting there in the evenings, a habit she had never formally encouraged but had also never discouraged. He was looking at the stars with that quality of stillness he had that she had begun to think of as his natural mode. She sat down in her rocking chair and told him Clara was asleep. "She is tough," he said, "like her mother." "She is 7, Fanny said. "She should not have to be tough yet." "No," he agreed. "She should not." The night insects were making their sound, and the air had cooled to something almost pleasant, and for a long time neither of them spoke. Then she said, because she was tired, and tired people sometimes tell the truth when careful people would not, "I am afraid I am going to lose this land." He turned his head to look at her. "The September payment to the bank, I have the wheat to cover it if the price holds, but if it drops or if the harvest comes in light or if anything goes wrong at the wrong moment, I am short." She paused. "I have not told anyone that." "I know," he said. "Why does that not surprise me?" He was quiet for a moment, then he said, "How short?" She told him the figure. He was quiet, calculating. "If the Southfield comes in as heavy as it looks like it will," he said, "and you get the Barrows Creek price per bushel that was posted last week, you will cover it with about $30 to spare." "If," she said. "If," he agreed. A lot of farming is if. You know farming, she had wondered. He handled farm work with the competence of someone trained to it, but also with a slightly distant quality, like a man doing something he knew well but from a long time ago. He looked back at the stars. "My family had land in Missouri when I was young." "What happened to it?" The pause this time was longer. "The war happened to it," he said finally. "My father did not come back." My mother held on as long as she could, then she did not hold on any more. She understood in the way that people who have lost things understand other people who have lost things without having to map out all the details. "How old were you?" 14 when the war ended, old enough to understand what was gone. "And after that," he shrugged, a slow lift and drop of one shoulder. "I moved, worked what I could find, moved again." "You have been drifting since you were 14 years old," she said. "More or less." She looked at his profile against the dark sky and felt something that was not quite pity, because pity would have been condescending to a man like this, but was adjacent to it. A kind of ache on his behalf, for the boy he had been and the life he had carried since. "Do you not want to stop?" she asked. He turned and looked at her fully then, and in the dim starlight she could not quite read his expression, but she felt it. She felt it the way you feel the change in air pressure before a storm. "I have been wondering that myself lately," he said. She should have changed the subject. Instead, she sat in the summer dark and let the words sit between them, and neither of them moved for a long time. And when she finally went inside, she felt the porch steps as she climbed them the way you feel the last step when you have been climbing a long time. August came like a hammer. The temperature climbed past anything reasonable and stayed there. The wheat ripened fast, faster than she had hoped, which was good for the harvest but meant she had to move quickly. The Weber boys, 3 of them, solid and willing and not very talkative, arrived on the 12th and they began to cut. Harvest was a particular kind of controlled emergency. Everything had to happen at once, in the right order, against the clock of the weather, and the threat of a storm that could flatten ripe wheat in 20 minutes if it arrived at the wrong angle. Fanny ran it like a general because she had to, assigning the men their sections, managing the timing of the reaper, organizing the binding and stacking. Clayton worked at her side from before sunrise to after sunset without complaint and without needing to be told twice about anything, which she valued more than she was prepared to say. On the second day of harvest, something important happened. The McCormick reaper threw a blade pin in the middle of the north field, which stopped everything because without the reaper they were cutting by hand, and at that pace they would lose a quarter of the crop to the weather before they finished. Fanny stood at the stalled reaper and looked at the broken pin with the flat, cold clarity of a woman who has run out of margin for error and knows it. She had a spare pin. In town, in the hardware store, 4 miles away. "I will go," Clayton said immediately. "Biscuit cannot run 4 miles and back in this heat," she said. "I will take the Weber boy's spare horse. That horse is barely broken." "I have ridden worse," he said, which she believed completely. He went. He made it to town in 40 minutes, which was faster than she had thought possible, and made it back in 50. And the pin went in, and the reaper was running again within the hour, and they did not lose the crop. It was the kind of day that is pure nerve and logistics, and she would not have made it through it as cleanly without him. And she knew this, and it made the feeling she had been carefully managing become considerably harder to manage. That evening, she found him in the barn checking Biscuit's legs after the day's work, talking to the horse in a low voice the way people talk to animals when they think no one is listening. She stopped in the doorway and listened for a moment without announcing herself, and the quiet domesticity of the scene, the man and the horse in the lamplight, did something to her chest that was frightening in its tenderness. "She did well today," Fanny said, coming in. He straightened. "She did. She is ready for real work now. You do not have to be careful with her anymore." "I was not being careful with her. I was being careful with your instructions." He smiled at that. It was a rare thing, his full smile, and it arrived like weather change, sudden and altering the whole quality of his face. She was standing closer to him than she usually stood, and in the lantern light he looked different than he did in the broad daylight of the fields. He looked like someone she wanted to know completely, and that wanting was the most frightening thing she had felt in a long time. She looked away. "Tomorrow we start on the south field," she said. "Early." "I will be up," he said. She went back to the house and sat at the kitchen table for 20 minutes without lighting a lamp and let herself feel the full weight of what was happening to her, which was that she was falling in love with a man she knew almost nothing about. A man who had arrived in the dark with blood on his shirt and no explanation of where he had come from or where he was going. A man with a hidden past and no attached present and possibly no future beyond the next horizon. She told herself that this was the most foolish thing she had ever done. She did not tell herself to stop. Harvest finished on the 20th of August, 3 days ahead of the estimate, and the yield from the south field was even better than Clayton had predicted. Fanny ran the numbers the evening the last load came in, and she did it twice to make sure, and she sat back and allowed herself 1 full minute of something that was almost euphoria before the next practical problem arrived to take its place. She would cover the bank payment, with $40 to spare, not 30. And the price at the cooperative had held. She found him in the barn that evening and told him the final numbers and watched his face as he processed them. He said nothing. But she saw something happen behind his eyes that looked very much like relief, and she understood that the relief was not entirely impersonal, that he had been carrying her worry alongside her without her having asked him to, and this made her feel things she had not felt in so long that she had to breathe carefully for a moment. "We should celebrate," she said. "Tomorrow I will make a proper dinner." "You do not have to do that," he said. "I know I do not have to," she said. "I want to. You worked this harvest as hard as any man I have ever seen work, and it is in, and we should mark that." He looked at her for a moment, and she thought he was going to deflect again, the way he often deflected anything that pointed toward his own value or effort, and instead he said, "That would be fine then. Thank you." The dinner was the first thing that was not about the farm. It was the first evening where the conversation wandered away from practical things and into other territory, and later she would think of it as the evening where they began, truly began, to know each other. Clara was at the table as she always was, eating her way through a supper of roast chicken and corn and fresh biscuits with the single-minded dedication of a child who has been working alongside adults all day and has earned her appetite. She was also, as she often was, asking questions. "Where did you live before here?" she asked Clayton. "A few places," he said, "before the few places. Missouri mostly." "My papa was from Ohio," Clara said. "Mama is from Virginia originally." Did you know Virginia was almost 2 states at once? West Virginia, Clayton said, nodding. It split during the war. Did you fight in the war? Clara, Fannie said. I am asking because he is old enough, Clara said, with the logical patience of a child who sees no problem with the question. Clayton met Fannie's eyes with a flicker of something that was almost amusement. I was a boy during the war, he said. Too young to fight. Mama's first husband before Papa died in the war, Clara said, with the casual delivery of a child who has heard family history enough times that it has lost its gravity for her. Fannie watched Clayton absorb this and file it away. She had been married before, briefly, at 17, to a young man from her Virginia county who had gone to war in 1861 and not come back. She had come west with Robert Garner in 1874, seeking the kind of fresh beginning that the eastern states seemed incapable of offering people who carried too much weight from the previous decade. How long have you been out west? Clayton asked her, and the question was simple, but beneath it was the real question, which was, who are you? Tell me more. 9 years, she said. Kansas suited me. It does not care who you were before. It only cares what you can do. That is one of the things I like about it, he said, and the other things you like about it. She said, and then was mildly surprised at herself for asking, because it was a question that invited him to say something revealing, and she had generally avoided those. He looked at the table for a moment, then he looked at her. The horizons, he said. Out here you can see what is coming. I have never liked being surprised. She thought about the bullet wound in his shoulder. And yet, she said. And yet, he agreed, and his mouth curved with something rueful and brief. Clara had fallen asleep at the table by 8 o'clock, which was a harvest season phenomenon, and Clayton carried her to her bed without being asked, which was something that undid the last of Fannie's careful internal architecture more thoroughly than anything else that had happened all summer. She was standing at the kitchen window when he came back, looking out at the dark that was not quite full dark yet, and she heard him come in and heard the particular silence that meant he had stopped in the doorway and was watching her, and she said, without turning around, "Where did you come from? Before you turned up in my barn." The silence lasted long enough that she thought he might not answer. "Dodge City," he said. "Before that, Wichita. Before that, the Texas Panhandle." "And who shot you?" He came into the kitchen, and she heard the scrape of the chair as he sat down at the table. She turned around and leaned against the counter and waited. "A man named Cord Harlan," he said. "He runs a gambling operation out of Dodge City, faro tables mostly, not entirely legitimate. What was your involvement?" "I was a dealer," he said. "I had been for about 8 months. I thought it was straightforward work. It turned out it was not. He was cheating. More than cheating. He was using the operation to move money for some men who do not have legitimate businesses. I found out because I am not good at pretending not to see things." "You said something." "I said something." He paused. "I was not smart about it. I went to the wrong person first, and Harlan found out before I could go to the right one. He did not want me gone from Dodge. He wanted me quietly gone from everywhere." Fannie absorbed this. "Is he still looking for you?" "He sent one man." "That was the shot. I do not think he will send more. I am not worth more than one man's effort." But I could not go back to Dodge, and I needed to get far enough away that the one man could not follow without it becoming an investment Harlan would not think worth making. She looked at him for a long time. "That is a real story," she said finally. "It is the true one," he said. "Why did it take you 3 months to tell me?" He looked at the table surface. "Because I did not want you to decide I was trouble and send me away." The honesty of it was so clean and direct that she did not know what to do with it for a moment. She crossed her arms, not against him but to contain herself. "Were you ever going to tell me?" "Yes," he said. "I was trying to figure out when." "Is Harlan's man still in the territory?" "I do not believe so. It has been 3 months. If he were close, something would have happened by now." "And you have heard nothing?" "Nothing." She looked at him, this man with his dark past and his careful ways and his hidden motives that turned out to be simpler and more human than she had feared. He had been running. He had stopped running in her barn. He had stayed because it turned out the stopping had been good for him, And also, she thought, because of something more than that. "I need you to understand," she said carefully, "that I cannot carry another person's risk on top of everything else I am carrying." "I know that," he said. "If at any point you believe you are putting my daughter in danger by being here, you have to tell me immediately." "I will," he said. "And if you ever lie to me again by way of leaving things out," she said, "you will find yourself explaining yourself on the road." He met her eyes steadily. "Understood." She pushed away from the counter and began clearing the supper dishes, because this was a thing she could do with her hands while her heart found its footing again. "Go get some sleep," she said. "There is plenty of fence work left on the east side and I want to start early." "Yes, ma'am," he said. She heard him leave. She stood at the washbowl for a long time before she started cleaning anything. September came in cooler than August, which was a mercy, and Fannie made her payment to the Barrows Creek Cooperative Banking House on the 8th of the month. Hadley, the bank manager, counted the bills with a faint expression of displeasure that she suspected had something to do with Elias Pratt's presence in the bank's social circle, and stamped her receipt with the particular administrative reluctance of a man who has been hoping for a different outcome. And she took the stamped receipt and walked out of the bank and stood on the main street of Barrows Creek in the September sunshine, and felt something release in her chest that had been wound tight for 14 months. She passed Pratt coming out of the general store on her way back to the wagon. He tipped his hat with the smooth courtesy of a man who has too much practice hiding what he actually thinks. "Fannie," he said, "I see you were at the bank." "I was," she said pleasantly. "Good day, Elias." She did not stop walking. On the drive back to the farm, with the wagon loaded with the supplies she had allowed herself to buy now that the immediate financial terror had lifted, she thought about Clayton Yates and what he had told her and what she had not yet said to him in return. She thought about the way he worked alongside her without competing with her or diminishing her, which was a thing she had not taken for granted, because she had known enough men who could not manage it. She thought about the way he was with Clara, which was neither overeager nor indifferent, but something natural and easy that Clara responded to without having to be coaxed. She thought about the way she felt when he was not in the room, which was a particular restless absence she had begun to notice with an alarming regularity. She was 31 years old. She was not a girl who confused gratitude with feeling. What she felt for Clayton Yates was not gratitude, though she was also grateful. What she felt was something older and more complicated, something that had been building since the night she had sat with him on the porch steps in July, and he had said he had been wondering about stopping. She wondered, on the drive back, whether he had been thinking about her the way she had been thinking about him. And then she looked at the wide Kansas sky and reminded herself that she had thought impractical things before and survived the consequences. The day she came back from Barrows Creek and told him the payment had gone through, something changed between them. Something became slightly more possible. As though the worst fear had been cleared away and left a space that other things could enter. October came in gold and sharp-edged. The farm settled into its post-harvest rhythms, slower and deeper, the work of preparation rather than emergency. Clayton put in the winter cover on the garden beds. He repaired the barn's rear wall where a board had split during the summer heat. He split enough wood to take them through the first half of winter and stacked it in the careful, dense way that would keep the worst of the weather out. And he did not leave. She had stopped telling herself he was about to. Sometime in September she had quietly surrendered that particular expectation without acknowledging to herself that she had done so, the way you stop bracing for a storm once you realize it has passed you by. The evening he said it, the evening she had been running from at the start of this, had built up the way a weather event builds, slowly at first and then with a gathering energy that could not be redirected. She had gone to get the water. He had been at the fence. The harvest had been in for 6 weeks. The western sky was the color of something precious, amber and coral and a thin thread of green at the horizon, and the air had the smell of October in it, which was the smell of things ripening and falling and completing. She had heard him moving at the fence line and turned to see him watching her with the full, unguarded attention of someone who has given up pretending he is looking at something else. And he had said it. I cannot seem to find a reason to leave. And she had told him it was the most dangerous thing he had ever said to her, and she had meant it, because she was standing on the edge of something that could not be walked back from, and she knew it, and the knowing was both terrifying and the most alive she had felt since before Robert died. "Then explain to me," she said, setting the water pail down in the October evening and looking at him straight, "what a reason to leave would look like, because I want to understand if we are talking about the same thing." He came away from the fence post and he walked toward her the way he did everything, with a deliberate, unhurried certainty, and he stopped a few feet from her, close enough that she could see the exact quality of his expression, which was a man who has weighed something for a long time and arrived at his conclusion. "A reason to leave," he said, "would be knowing that staying was not what you wanted, that being here was trouble to you, that Clara would be confused or hurt, that the risk of who I am and what followed me here was still a real thing." "And what do you conclude about each of those?" she asked. "I conclude," he said, "that I do not know what you want. I know what I would like you to want. That is not the same thing, and I think I owe you the honesty of saying so before I say anything else." She looked at him for a long time. The sun was low, and the field behind him was the color of honey, and the man himself, this stubborn, battered, complicated drifter who had fixed her fence and saved her harvest and carried her daughter to bed without being asked, was looking at her as though she was the most important horizon he had ever faced. "What would you like me to want?" she said. He breathed out slowly. "For me to stay," he said, "not in the barn, not as a hired hand. As something that deserves a real word that I am not going to say without your permission." She was 31 years old, and she had lost two men she had cared about, one to war and one to fever, and she had built herself back both times with the grim, patient work of someone who has run out of the luxury of falling apart. She had 60 acres and a daughter, and a debt just cleared, and a whole approaching winter that would be the first one in 2 years she was facing without existential dread. And she had this man, with his dark past and his copper-brown eyes, and his way of doing things right without being asked, standing in her golden October field and asking her permission. "Clayton Yates," she said, "if you are about to say what I think you are about to say, then I am going to need to know that Cord Harlan and his 1-cent man are genuinely done with you, because I have built something on this land and I cannot let it be a target. I have written to a man in Dodge City I trust," he said, "a federal marshal who was already looking at Harlan's operation. He replied 3 weeks ago. Harlan was arrested in late August. The federal charges have been laid. He is not sending anyone for anyone right now." She stared at him. "You received that letter 3 weeks ago. Yes. You have known for 3 weeks that the threat was resolved. Yes. And you did not tell me." He had the grace to look at her steadily while he said the next thing. "No, because once the danger was resolved, the only remaining question was the personal one, and I did not know how to raise the personal question without it seeming as though I had only been staying because of obligation, which I had not, but I could not prove that unless I stayed past the point where I had any practical reason to." She understood exactly what he had done. He had waited until the harvest was in and the payment was made and the danger was resolved and the practical reasons had all run out, and then he had stood in her field on an October evening and said, "I cannot find a reason to leave," and meant it to be the truest possible thing. "You are an extremely deliberate man," she said. "I have been called worse," he said. She looked at the water pail at her feet. She looked at the western sky going dark. She looked at the fence he had mended, and the field that had come in good, and the barn where his horse stood in the paddock beside her biscuit without either of them seeming to mind. Then she looked at him. "Then stay," she said, as something with a real word. His expression shifted, and for just a moment she could see everything behind it, the guarded, solitary life he had been living since he was 14 years old, and the particular quality of what it meant for that life to have found something worth stopping for. He closed the last 2 feet between them and she did not step back. He reached out and took her hand, not the dramatic claiming gesture of a man in a novel, but the careful, questioning touch of a man who has asked permission and been given it and still wants to be sure. "There will need to be a conversation," she said. "That is more specific than this one." "Yes," he said. "And Clara will need to be part of it, in the appropriate way." "I would not have it any other way," he said. "And you are going to have to stop sleeping in the barn," she said, "eventually, when the time is right." "I am in no hurry," he said, though the way he said it suggested he was a little, which made something warm and certain move through her. "Winter is coming," she said. "We will have a long time to talk." "That suits me," he said. She squeezed his hand once firmly, and then released it, because Clara was probably going to appear in the doorway any minute looking for supper, and Fannie believed in doing things in proper sequence. "Come inside," she said. "I will make dinner." He followed her in. He did not go back to the barn that night in the permanent sense, though it took until the following spring before everything was arranged in the order that she required, because Fannie Garner did not rush things she considered significant. That winter was the first winter since Robert's death that she did not dread. There was wood enough and food enough and a man at the table who was learning, day by day, what it meant to be present without conditions. He was not a perfect man. He was sometimes too quiet in ways that required patience. He had a particular stubbornness about admitting when he was struggling with something, a habit of managing his difficulties alone that she had to coax him out of by example, by showing him that her own vulnerabilities were not weaknesses but simply the honest accounting of a human life. But he learned. He learned faster than most, because he was paying attention in the complete, deliberate way he paid attention to everything. And she, in turn, learned things about him. That he had a wry, dry wit that emerged slowly but was worth waiting for. That he was genuinely good with animals and children in a way that was not performance but instinct. That he read everything he could get his hands on and remembered it, so that conversations with him could veer from wheat prices to the politics of Reconstruction to the particulars of migratory birds in a single evening. That he woke from bad dreams occasionally, quietly and without making a scene, and lay still until they receded, and that the darkness he had carried in his 14-year drifting life had not made him hard in the destructive sense, but only careful, only measured, only deliberate. Clara's conversion from wariness to complete allegiance happened in December, and it happened because of a horse. Fannie's neighbor to the south, a woman named Mi Kunlai who ran a small operation with her brother, had a mare who was foaling in the wrong weather, too cold and too early, and the foal came wrong side, and Mi's brother had given up on it by the time Clayton and Fannie arrived, because Mi had sent a boy over asking for help. Clayton spent 4 hours in Mi's barn bringing that foal right, cold and exhausted at the end of it, but the foal lived, a little bay thing that stood up on its unsteady legs and blinked at the lantern light. Clara, who had been allowed to watch from the barn door at a safe distance, said with absolute conviction the next morning, "He should be a vet." "Veterinary science is not quite what he is," Fannie said. "He saved the baby horse," Clara said. "That is what a vet is. He is very good with animals, yes. He is good with people too," Clara said with the settled confidence of a 7-year-old who has made a decision and is simply informing the adults. "He is going to stay, right? He is not going to leave again." "He is going to stay," Fannie said. "Good," Clara said. "I told Winnie Preston at school and she said drifters always leave, and I told her she was wrong about our drifter. Our drifter." Fannie pressed her lips together against the warmth of it. "You told Winnie Preston about Mr. Yates." "I said a man came to help on our farm," Clara said. "That is not secret." "No," Fannie agreed. "That is not secret." January brought a blizzard that kept them all in the house for 4 days, which was the kind of enforced proximity that either resolves things or destroys them. And what it did for Fannie and Clayton was resolve them, quietly and completely, over card games with Clara and long evenings by the stove with books, and the particular ease that comes from being with someone who does not require you to perform anything. He asked her to marry him in February, which was not the most romantic month in Kansas but was when it felt right to him. And so he did it then, practically and sincerely, sitting across from her at the kitchen table with his coffee cup in front of him, and his expression that of a man who has made a decision and is presenting it without theatrics. "I would like to marry you," he said, "if that is something you are willing to consider." She looked at him for a long time. "You are asking if I am willing to consider it or if my answer is yes." "Both," he said. "They are the same answer in this case," she said. He exhaled. "Then yes." "Then yes," she said. He smiled, the full smile, sudden and bright, and she felt it in her bones. He reached across the table and took her hand and held it for a long time, and neither of them felt the need to say much more than that. They were married in April of 1884, in the small white church in Barrows Creek, on a morning when the prairie was just beginning to show the first green hints of spring, and the sky was a particular deep blue that seemed to have been arranged for the occasion. It was a modest ceremony, as befitted two practical people in a western Kansas town, with me Conley as Fannie's witness and me's brother Tom as Clayton's, and Clara in her good dress looking both solemn and privately triumphant. Elias Pratt was not in attendance, which surprised no one. He had attempted, in January, one final push of the subtle, financial pressure variety, stopping at the farm to suggest that the coming year's planting costs might be worth discussing with someone who had the resources to help, a suggestion that Fannie had declined with the particular quiet steel she kept for moments like this. When word reached him in February that the widow Garner intended to marry the drifter she had taken on, his reaction was reportedly one of sharp displeasure. He did not act on that displeasure in any form that mattered, partly because Fannie Garner was not a woman who could be easily moved by displeasure, and partly because Clayton Yates was not the kind of man that other men made targets of lightly. The wedding was small and honest, and in keeping with who they were. After the ceremony, standing outside the church in the April wind while Clara threw dried flower petals that she had been saving since the previous summer for just this purpose, Clayton looked at Fannie in her good dress with her hair pinned up and her brown eyes warm, and he said, quietly so only she could hear, "I should have found this barn sooner." She laughed, which was a sound that had become more frequent in the past several months, and that Clayton had grown very attached to producing. "You found it when you found it," she said. "That is enough. Is it enough?" He said, and it was the old question, the one beneath all the other questions, the one about whether a man who had been moving for 14 years could really be enough for a woman who had built something from nothing and held it by force of will. She took his hand. "More than enough," she said. They went back to the farm and they planted the spring wheat and they made their plans. The summer of 1884 was a good one. The wheat came in well again, and this time Clayton negotiated the cooperative price himself, which he did with a calm directness that resulted in a better price per bushel than Barrows Creek farmers had seen in 3 years, a fact that circulated through the local farming community with enough enthusiasm that 2 other farmers asked him to negotiate on their behalf the following season, which he did. He had a head for numbers and for people, and these things combined well. He also, that summer, began to talk about expanding the farm. "If we added another 20 acres to the north," he said one evening, spreading his hand-drawn map on the kitchen table, "and drilled a second well, we could increase our yield significantly without straining the existing infrastructure." She leaned over the map. "That 20 acres is currently owned by the county. It is listed as available for homestead claim." "I know," he said. "That is a significant undertaking," she said. "It is," he agreed. "But the yield would justify the cost by the 3rd year. The soil north of us is similar composition to our north field, which was our heaviest producer this year." She looked at the map and then at him. He was sitting with his shoulder angled toward her and his finger on the north section, and his expression was the look of someone who has stopped thinking about the next horizon and started thinking about depth instead of distance, about making the thing in front of him as good as it can be. "File the claim," she said. He looked up. "That is all. You have done the calculation. I trust your calculation." He held her gaze for a moment. "I will file it next week," he said, they expanded the farm. The well was drilled in late summer by a crew Clayton hired out of Dodge City, and it came in at a good depth with clean water, which was not guaranteed in western Kansas, and made Fannie feel that the universe was, for once, cooperating. Clara started at the Barrows Creek schoolhouse in August, which was a milestone that Fannie had been preparing for all year. The school was run by a young teacher named Miss Prout, who had come west from Ohio with ideas about education, and had found, in western Kansas, children who were rough and practical and desperately eager to learn. Clara came home on the first day with a list of 17 things she wanted to know more about, which Miss Prout had mentioned in passing and not fully explained, and Clayton spent the evening working through the list with her in the patient, methodical way of someone who genuinely enjoys this kind of exercise. Fannie watched them from the doorway, the girl and the man with their heads bent over a piece of paper, and she felt the particular happiness that is not separate from its own vulnerability, the happiness of knowing exactly what you have and therefore knowing exactly what you stand to lose. She was used to loss. She had been visited by it enough times to know its geography. But she found, that evening and in the evenings that followed, that the happiness was not diminished by this knowledge. If anything, the knowledge made her pay closer attention, made her less likely to take the ordinary moments for granted, the coffee in the mornings and the arguments about the best way to store potatoes and the sound of Clara laughing at something Clayton said, and the weight of his hand when he reached for hers without thinking about it. In October of 1884, exactly 1 year after the evening in the field when he had said, "I cannot seem to find a reason to leave," Fannie told Clayton she was expecting a child. She told him at the breakfast table because she was not the kind of woman who stages revelations, and his face did the thing she had been watching it do all year, which was become completely transparent for just a moment, letting through everything he kept carefully managed the rest of the time. What came through was not complicated. It was pure. "A child," he said. "In the spring," she said. "April, I think." He sat for a moment with his coffee cup in both hands, looking at the table in the way he looked at things when he was absorbing them fully. Then he looked up at her, and the expression on his face was the most unguarded she had ever seen, and she loved him so completely in that moment that it was almost difficult to bear. "Are you well?" he asked first, which told her everything she needed to know about the man she had married. "I am perfectly well," she said. "It is early and I am not troubled." He reached across the table and covered her hand with his and did not say anything else for a long time, which was also fine, because some things do not need words, they only need presence. Clara was told at supper and responded with an immediate and comprehensive set of opinions about names, most of which Fannie privately found endearing and publicly judged unrealistic. The negotiations about names became a running conversation through the fall and winter, a kind of family entertainment that kept the long evenings from growing repetitive. The child was born in late April of 1885, a boy, healthy and loud, and possessed from the first moment of an extremely decided personality. They named him Robert Clayton Yates, which had been Clayton's suggestion, and had made Fannie sit quietly for a long moment before she nodded with the specific quality of emotion that means yes and thank you and everything at once. Clara appointed herself chief of operations in the matter of the baby, which Robert did not initially appreciate, being an infant with limited appreciation for authority, but which he gradually accommodated as he grew into the kind of robust, interested small person who was suited to a big sister with opinions. The farm continued to grow. The expanded north section came in strong in the harvest of 1885 and the year after that, and Clayton began to develop a reputation in the county that had nothing to do with his past and everything to do with his present. He knew soil and weather and the particular economics of western Kansas farming with an intimacy that came from having put his back into it season after season, and he had a way of talking to the other farmers in the county, at the cooperative meetings and on the main street of Barrows Creek. That was direct without being overbearing, informed without being showy. He also, quietly and without making it into anything formal, spent a Saturday in the spring of 1885 writing out a clean account of what he had witnessed in Dodge City and sending it to the federal marshal who had prosecuted Cord Harlan, so that the record was complete and his own name was on the right side of it. Harlan had been convicted in a federal court in Wichita in early 1884 and was serving his sentence, the threat gone as thoroughly as the drifter's past could be gone. In the summer of 1886, he filed to have his name added to the farm deed alongside Fannie's. She had offered this the previous year, and he had asked to wait until he felt he had earned it fully, which she had found simultaneously frustrating and deeply characteristic. When the deed came back from the county with both their names on it, he held the paper for a long time before he folded it and put it in the tin box where they kept the important documents. "Satisfied?" she said. "Yes," he said. "Good," she said. "Now stop being stubborn about things you have already earned." He looked at her with that slow smile. "I will consider it." Elias Pratt sold his own spread in 1886 and moved to Wichita, which Fannie found that she felt almost nothing about. He was a chapter that had closed before it ever truly opened, a threat that had been rendered irrelevant by the simple, daily fact of her life being built correctly. The second child arrived in the winter of 1887, a girl this time, born in December with the tenacity of someone who has chosen the least convenient season and intends to make the most of it. They named her June, for the month the story had really started, the month a bleeding stranger had been found in a barn, and a woman who knew better had decided to help him anyway. June Yates was, from the very beginning, exactly as stubborn as both of her parents and twice as loud, which the family agreed was probably fair. By 1888, the Yates farm was the most productive spread in their section of the county, with 80 acres under cultivation, a solid stand of winter wheat, a kitchen garden that Fannie ran with the efficiency of a small army, 2 healthy children who were growing fast and strong, and a reputation in Barrows Creek that was built on simple things, on paying debts on time and keeping promises and working harder than was strictly necessary. On the October evening that was 5 years to the day after Clayton had said those words in the field, Fannie made a proper dinner and did not explain why, and Clayton noticed without asking, and Clara, who was now 12 and perceptive enough to understand a private occasion when she saw one, took Robert and June for a walk after supper to look at stars, with the particular tact of a child who has grown up watching her parents love each other well. They sat on the porch in the October dark, the same porch where they had first sat together that summer night 5 years ago, and the air had changed between them. 5 years, she said. 5 years, he agreed. "I've been thinking about what you said that evening by the fence." She looked at the field. "I cannot seem to find a reason to leave." "I meant it exactly," he said. "I know," she said. "That was what terrified me." He turned to look at her. In the lamplight from the kitchen window she could see his face clearly, a face she knew now the way she knew the contours of her own land in all weather and all light, in difficulty and in ease. "Are you still terrified?" he asked. "No," she said. "Not of that." "What then?" She was quiet for a moment. "Of how much there is to lose," she said. "That is the only fear left. And I have decided that it is a better kind of fear than the one I had before." He reached over and took her hand in the same careful way he had taken it that October evening 5 years ago, and held it the same way, firmly and with intention, and she felt the same thing she had felt then, which was that this was right, not convenient or practical or safe, but right in the way that fundamental things are right. "We have not done badly," he said, looking at the field and the barn and the sky. "We have not," she agreed. "I think we can do more," he said. She smiled without looking at him. "I think so too," she said. From somewhere down by the creek, they could hear Clara's voice and Robert's answering it and June's high, certain contribution to whatever they were discussing. And the sounds were the sounds of children who are well and safe, and belonged to a life that was built on purpose, stone by stone, season by season, by two people who had both been carrying their losses alone, until the peculiar grace of one wrong night in June had put them in the same barn and let them find each other. Fannie Garner had become Fannie Yates, and the farm had become something both of them owned completely, not just in the legal sense of the deed in the tin box, but in the way that people who have worked together through difficulty own things, with the full weight of their shared effort and their shared survival, and the slow, patient accumulation of a shared life. Clayton Yates, who had been a drifter since he was 14 years old, had stayed through the harvest and then through the next harvest and the one after that, and had found in the staying everything that the moving had never quite been able to provide. He had found, in 60 acres of Kansas wheatland, and a woman who would not be pushed, and a daughter with opinions and 2 children born into the life they had made together, the answer to a question he had been carrying so long he had nearly forgotten he was asking it. The question was whether there was a place that was his, whether there was a life that fit, whether the long road he had been on was going towards something or only away from things. The answer was the farm in the October evening light. The answer was Fannie's hand in his. The answer was the sound of 3 children counting stars by the creek. He could not find a reason to leave because he had, at last, found every reason to stay. And the prairie evening closed around the Yates farm as it always did, wide and dark and full of stars, indifferent to human stories in the way of very large things. And the lamp burned in the kitchen window, and the children's voices rose and fell by the water, and the wheat stubble lay silver in the moonlight over 80 acres that belonged, completely and without reservation, to 2 people who had earned it all. The story was not simple, and it was not without its weight. It had been shaped by loss and war, and the long distances a person could travel without arriving anywhere. But the ending was exactly what it needed to be: 2 people on a porch in October, holding hands in the dark, and everything around them bearing the particular quality of a life that has been built right. Fannie leaned her head against Clayton's shoulder, which she did sometimes in the evenings when she had decided that practicality could wait for a few minutes, and he turned his head and pressed his lips to her hair, which was the particular gesture she liked best out of all his gestures, the quiet, certain one that said "I am here" in the language of someone who no longer had any intention of being anywhere else. The wind came off the plains with the smell of autumn in it, dry and clean and carrying everything away, and what remained was the 2 of them and the light and the good, solid weight of everything they had made. That was enough. That was more than enough. That was, as Fannie would have said if she were in the business of saying such things, exactly what it was supposed to be.